Operational definitions are when we take a construct in psychology or a concept that is love, memory, intelligence, creativity, things like that, a concept, when we take that and translate it into a measured operation, that is how we are actually going to test creativity or how we're going to test memory. That is what we mean by an operational definition. Somebody might define intelligence one way, while another researcher might define it a different way. So it's important for us to be very specific in the way that we define our variables. So the really cool thing about psychology is that we do study so many interesting concepts and constructs, but they are very difficult to measure. Unlike molecules that you can actually, put your hands on or see, or chemicals that you can mix together and see that reaction for sure, we have to kind of not guess at, but we have to sort of approximate our variables. We have to really measure memory, but there are hundreds of ways that we could possibly measure it. So we need to figure out how best it fits our study for our purposes, for our hypothesis, and then we choose that way, and then we tell everyone else exactly how we measured it so they can replicate it if they want to. Remember that replication is extremely important for the scientific method. So again, operational definitions are the translation of those constructs I was talking about, those invisible things that still are there, we know they're there, into exact, measured, and defined operations, or how we are actually going to do them in our study. So another way to look at it is they are specific procedures that are used to measure and produce a construct. So we measure them, like if my outcome is memory, for example, I want to decide how I'm actually going to measure that. If I want to give you a memory test, I could do it a number of ways. I could flash a bunch of numbers up and then see how many you remember. I could read a passage and see how much of the content you remember. I could have you count backwards while I give you images, and then have you tell me what images you remember seeing, even though you were distracted. So depending on what I'm interested in, interference, or if you're texting, what did you see on the screen as you were trying to text and look at the screen at the same time. So if I'm interested in interference, then I would have to have some kind of interference in with my memory to test that. So the idea basically is to take one of the, a construct, any construct that you are looking at, whether it's texting and driving, or attachment style, or love, or aggression, any of these things, intelligence, all of them, if we're going to study them, we have to be able to define them operationally. So we take them and we specifically translate them into something quantifiable. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier about quantifiability in science. So how might we take passionate love, for example, and operationally define that? Well, we could define that as physiological arousal, as specifically defined by increased heart rate, changes in galvanic skin response or skin conductance, sweat basically, and maybe blood pressure and pupil dilation in the presence of the beloved. So those are the things, if we see those, we can measure the extent to which the person is experiencing passionate love. So we can actually measure those things exactly and precisely, and then we can tell everybody else that that's how we measured them. If we are going to manipulate something, say we're going to make a memory test more difficult or less difficult, then we could add interference, like I was saying before. We could have you count backwards by threes, and while I'm presenting you with images or a story or random words, and then have you try to remember them. And then in another condition, you simply would just be shown those things without the interference. And that would be how I specifically would be defining interference in that case, making memory more difficult or less difficult to do. Intelligence, again, the same thing. I need to specify, am I going to use the Wechsler intelligence test, and Am I going to use the final score on it? Am I going to look at subscales on it? What specifically am I going to look at? And then something like creativity. There are all kinds of ways that I could measure this, but I, as a scientist who am operationally defining my variables, need to specify by saying, okay, I'm going to say that creativity is measured by this questionnaire. When I give you this questionnaire, the score on this questionnaire gives me your creativity score. I could also simply have you solve a bunch of creative puzzles and score you myself based on how well you did. I could also, for example, as a friend of mine did one time, amazingly, this amazing creative friend of mine, I asked her to come up with as many Halloween costume ideas as she possibly could in like a 5-minute period, and she came up with over 100. She kept up coming with one after another, and she finally came up with an ostrich jockey that she ended up going to a Halloween party in. I don't know how that actually turned out. I didn't see the final version of it, but an ostrich jockey, someone who's riding an ostrich. Anyway, so that's another way that I could have defined creativity. Quick, how many Halloween costumes can you come up with in a 5-minute period? That's an odd way of defining it, but it's still creative. So hopefully you understand then that operational definitions can be very fun to come up with. They have to be accurate. They have to be something that other people will agree on. You can't say that creativity is memory. You can't just haphazardly choose some random thing. It needs to be meaningful, and it needs to represent the construct itself and be a true measure of it, or truly to make that happen, like interference, for example. So it's challenging, but it's, again, one of the more fun parts of psychology, because again, we can't really put our hands on them. We have to, a lot of times, indirectly measure them. So hopefully this is helpful to you. I want you guys to try to operationally define a couple of variables of your own, and let's see how you do. Pick 2 variables that you think are related to each other in any way. They could be causal related or correlational, which we'll talk about in a minute. Just any kind of relationship, 2 variables, and operationally define them. And I will see how you guys do on that, and see you next time.